Attention all true crime fanatics. Welcome to the Open Homicide Podcast. Please join us as we examine contentious and controversial narratives of famous homicides from around the world. We dig deeper, we question the official story, and we discuss alternative theories. Here now is the host of our show, Skip Pulley.
Welcome to the Open Homicide Podcast. I am your host, Skip Pulley. Thank you for joining us for another historical episode of the Open Homicide Podcast. This episode is part one in a multi-part series about the public execution of Abraham Lincoln. And we refer to it as a public execution rather than an assassination, because essentially that's what it was. And before I even get into what the official story is, I want to explain why it was a public execution rather than an assassination. And the same holds true of the public execution of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in Dealey Plaza. The point of murdering these presidents was to do it in front of everyone, so it would set an example. And let me explain what I mean. Lincoln especially was known at that time when the war was winding down and in the days following the surrender of Lee. He was known for walking all around town by himself. And he did that during the war. The only time that security was heightened in fear of a assassination attempt was when he first got to town. When he was first elected, everyone, in his office and a lot of his security detail and a lot of people who worked for him were afraid that, someone was going to pick him off. There was tensions running high, as they say. But as the war, went on, even though everyone knew that Maryland was definitely a secessionist state and D.C. was, for the most part, at best 50-50 secessionist town, those fears waned, as it were. And he got used to either, driving his horse and carriage around by himself, walking around by himself. And if someone wanted to kill him, if the goal, as it were, was just to kill him, they could have just waited till he took a walk. I mean, he wasn't a young man. They could have, or even if the plot was as it was originally planned, supposedly kidnapping, they could have done that easily as well. I mean, just he's walking around at night. They could have walked up behind him, stabbed him, choked him to death, pushed him into front of a carriage. And I know this all sounds horrible, but that could have easily happened if the goal was just to kill him. The goal was to have him murdered in front of so many people to where they would tell everyone, oh my God, it was, such a horrible event, and they killed him in front of everyone. The big thing that comes out of these historical assassinations is people are like, oh, I'll never forget where I was when I heard, so-and-so about such and such, and oh, it was such a tragic day. And it's the psychological effect of murdering someone in front of a crowd. And the same could be said for JFK. Look at all, listen, hey, Jack's my boy. I ain't up front. I'm with him. But yeah, he liked to fool around, and he was pretty lax on, who knew about what. And, his security detail knew what the score was. They knew, what he was doing. Honestly, if the goal was just to kill JFK, they could have waited till he went to one of his girlfriend's house. They could have got there first, number one, hid in the closet, waited till JFK got his drawers down, and then hopped out on him and bang, bang, it's done. Or, whatever. They'd be out the window and gone before these Secret Service guys even got in the room. Now, they would have had a hell of a time explaining that, obviously. But my point is, there were so many opportunities to kill any of these guys if they just wanted to kill them. If the goal was just to have them dead, they could have done that. But the goal, as I said before, is to kill them in front of everyone, and that's why we say it is a public execution. But let's run it down super quick, because this is definitely going to be a 3 or 4 part episode. In case anyone really has never thought about the official story of the Lincoln, quote, assassination, it is insanely absurd. I mean, for everything to happen the way they said it happened, it's something that you would have to be a child in order to believe. But let's go over the basics. The official story is that Abraham Lincoln was, quote, assassinated by famed actor and, quote, Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth on the evening of April 14th, 1865, which just happened to be Good Friday, while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Just 5 days earlier, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, effectively signaling an end to the bloody U.S. Civil War, or more accurately, a war between the states. What is less widely known is that the assassination of Lincoln was allegedly part of a larger plot that was to have included the simultaneous assassinations of General Grant, Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Now, eventually, 9 of the people who were accused of the conspiracy to assassinate all of those people, 9 of those people faced trial as co-conspirators. So 8 of them by military tribunal, which was Mary Surratt, David Harold, George Azarod, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Loughlin, Edwin Spangler, and Lewis Payne or Lewis Powell, depending on who's writing the book. I guess I'm not sure if they even knew what his real name was. Half the time you'll read it as Lewis Payne, the other half you'll see it as Lewis Powell. And there was another person who stood trial alone, and that was John Surratt. 4 were executed. 3 received life sentences. 1 was given a 6-year prison term, and 1 was acquitted. As for Booth, he was supposedly captured and gunned down at Garrett's barn on April 26, 1865, so he never made it to trial. So the official story of what happened on the night Lincoln was shot is as follows. Lincoln was in a theater box at Ford's Theater watching a play with his wife Mary, an officer named Major Henry Rathbone, and that officer's fiancée, Clara Harris, who also happened to be Rathbone's stepsister. John Wilkes Booth managed to make his way into the corridor where the theater box was. He was able to get into the box, and armed only with a 1-shot Derringer pistol and a dagger, he supposedly shot Lincoln behind the left ear and then scuffled with Rathbone and injured him supposedly with his dagger and tore his arm open, then leapt over the front part of the theater box onto the stage, which is where he supposedly broke his leg, and we'll get into that later. Made his way to the middle of the stage, waved his dagger, yelled "Sic Semper Tyrannis," then walked, did not run, but walked off stage right, which is the far end of the stage, exited the theater through the backstage exit and mounted a horse that was in the alley that someone was holding for him, and he rode away into the night. There's so many insane irregularities in this story. It's just mind-blowing that you have so many historians who have written extensively about this supposed assassination, and very, very few of them have pointed out everything that is wrong with the story, which is just so ridiculous. But before we get into the absolute insanity of the official story, let's hear about the sponsor of today's episode, the Indie Film Group Network and the Indie Film and Music Groups.
This episode is sponsored by the Indie Film Group Network at indiefilmgroups.com, a collective representing several independent filmmaking groups in the U.S. and around the world. The Indie Film Group Network has chapters in Charlotte, Atlanta, the NC Triad, New York, New Jersey, Nevada, and the Pacific Northwest. IFGN promotes all aspects of independent filmmaking, marketing, distribution, and exhibition. To join us or for more information, please join our Facebook groups. Visit indiefilmgroups.com or email us at indiefilmgroups@gmail.com with a short bio and your contact information. Be sure to subscribe to the Indie Film Group Network's YouTube channel. Subscribers are eligible to be a guest on or co-host the Indie Film Group podcast.
Thank you so much, Ali, my dear. And for more information on the Indie Film Group Network, feel free to email indiefilmgroups@gmail.com. So let's get right into the most popular segment of the show, entitled Did You Know? Let's kick off. Did you know that John Wilkes Booth was a 33rd degree Freemason and most likely a Union spy who worked for Stanton? There is documented evidence of Booth giving false information and knowingly giving false information to Southern agents when he would go on the road down south with theater companies to perform plays. So there is a strong indication that he could have been a double agent, but he was most likely simply a Union spy. Did you know that Ulysses S. Grant, who was invited to go watch the play with Abe Lincoln and his wife, decided not to go at the very last minute, and the excuse that he gave was he and his wife were going to see his daughter in New Jersey. The problem with that is, if they had waited until the next morning, which would have been Saturday morning, and took that train, the Saturday morning train, they could have gone straight through to New Jersey, and they would have arrived right about at the same time, if not a few hours earlier, than they did when they decided to take the Friday evening train, which had a long layover in Philadelphia. Now, there has been a lot of confusion. Authors have written books that claim that Grant had business in Philadelphia, or they wanted to visit someone in Philadelphia, but there isn't any evidence for that, and it's really unusual for someone like Grant to knowingly inconvenience himself, especially, in that situation. It's really suspect. I mean, that whole thing is really suspicious. Did you know that Mary Todd Lincoln, 2 weeks prior to the assassination, purchased $1,200, roughly the equivalent of $25,000 in today's currency, worth of mourning and funeral clothes? And it is rumored that she also purchased a coffin. Now, everyone knows she's crazy at this point, especially Abe. But put yourself in his position. You come home one day and find a whole bunch of mourning clothes and black funeral gowns strewn about. Honestly, it's time to put her out of the house. I know you have to be sensitive when it comes to mental illness, but I mean, that is what we call a red flag. I mean, I don't know if the coffin part is true, but there's evidence that she purchased the mourning clothes and the funeral attire, which is in and of itself quite enough. So, you know, again, this just gets weirder and weirder. Also, keep in mind that Mary Lincoln owned and carried a Derringer pistol, a pearl handle Derringer pistol that was never recovered. And I don't know if this makes any difference or not, but she was also an opium addict and she was left-handed. So put a pin in that. Did you know that the attack, the supposed alleged attack on William Seward probably never even happened? He was wounded, according to the official story, in the same exact places as his injuries from a fall from a carriage he had a couple of weeks prior to that. So that is really coincidental. The guy's laying at home trying to heal up from some injuries he had from falling from a horse-drawn carriage a couple of weeks earlier, and somebody comes and attacks him and stabs him in those exact same spots. I mean, what are the odds? But that's the official story. So Seward was supposedly recuperating after being severely injured in a fall from a horse-drawn carriage 9 days earlier. Seward had suffered a broken lower jaw, a fractured right arm, torn ligaments in his foot, and heavy bruising over much of his body. And these were the exact same injuries reported after his attack, which appears to have been staged. Conveniently, the first three people to arrive at that crime scene just happened to be Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, and Surgeon General Joseph Barnes. So, I mean, again, this thing just gets crazier and crazier. The guy who was supposedly had attacked Stanton, Lewis Payne or Lewis Powell, depending on who you talk to, had never been to the Seward home, ever. But the official story is he knew exactly how to find Seward. I mean, this was a big house. But he went right directly to the guy's bedroom and stabbed him. He only had a knife and a bludgeon, and a bludgeon is like, you don't hear that word much these days. It's like a shillelagh, or like a table leg, or the leg from a piano stool. It's just like it's something that you use just to beat the shit out of somebody. Supposedly, this guy, Lewis Payne or Powell, gravely wounded 6 people in hand-to-hand combat, and 4 of them were supposedly able-bodied men, and yet, as photos taken after his arrest just days later revealed, that he didn't have even so much as a scratch. So this thing just gets more and more insane. Did you know that John Wilkes Booth's body was never positively identified after he was supposedly shot and killed at Garrett's Farm in Virginia? A man named John Boyd was identified as the man who was killed. A tall, red-headed man in a rebel uniform introduced himself at the Garrett home as John Boyd. During the standoff in the barn with Booth's supposed would-be captors, the name Booth was never even spoken by anyone. When David Harold, the co-conspirator who escaped D.C. with Booth, surrendered and exited the barn, leaving his companion inside the barn, he insisted that he did not know the other man, who claimed his name was Boyd. Both Dr. John May and an enlisted man both claimed that the dead man was not Booth. Did you know that the telegraph service went out in D.C. after the Lincoln assassination? For 2 to 3 hours, there was an interruption in the telegraph service in and out of Washington following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which was reminiscent of the JFK assassination, when the phone service in D.C. went out for an hour after he was assassinated. So, I mean, you can believe in coincidence, but that is one hell of a coincidence if you believe in that type of thing. Did you know that Major Rathbone, who was supposedly very seriously injured in his scuffle with John Wilkes Booth, showed no signs of being injured at any time, and there was no record that he was ever treated for any injuries? No one at the theater saw blood on Booth's knife, on his hands, or on his clothes. No one saw any blood on Major Rathbone, on his person, on his clothes, or on the floor of the theater box. In addition, there was not enough time between the gunshot and the stage exit for a struggle with Rathbone to have taken place. His fiancée never screamed, never said a word, and apparently didn't do anything. Never, even after the whole thing was over, she never made a sound. I mean, what? Supposedly, no one screamed until Booth left the stage and Mary Lincoln finally screamed. So, you have a guy who shot and another guy who supposedly stabbed. No one says anything. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's hard to believe that people even believe that. Did you know that the gas lights, which was the mode of lighting that they had in DC at that time for street lights, the gas lights went out along Booth's escape route, and only along Booth's escape route. At the same time that the telegraph system mysteriously went down, someone at the gasworks on Maryland Avenue shut off the gas that fed the lights around the Capitol and westward along Pennsylvania Avenue, plunging the assassination's escape route into darkness at the most opportune time. Coincidence after coincidence. It's ridiculous. Did you know that Booth's body was not only never positively identified at Garrett's barn, it was also never positively identified at the coroner's inquest? During the alleged inquest, none of Booth's peers in the theater community, many of whom were present in Washington at the time, were brought on board the ship that Booth's body was on to ID the body. No members of the Booth family were enlisted to view the body at all. And none of Booth's so-called or alleged co-conspirators, many of whom were being held on the very same ship, were allowed to ID the body. A total of 13 people were permitted to view the body. All but the war photographer Alexander Gardner and his assistant and a hotel bellhop or clerk were connected to the War Department. So everyone except those 3 people had ties to Stanton and the War Department. It's insane. Did you know that Mary Lincoln handpicked and selected by name Sergeant John Parker, the soldier who would abandon his post and leave the door to the theater box at Ford's Theater unguarded, and he went to get drunk of his own admission. And this is who Mary Lincoln selected by name and insisted on being Abe's bodyguard, and even wrote a letter of recommendation for. Now, here's a guy who had a reputation for being unreliable and often being involved in what was known as misconduct. But the misconduct that actually very few people wrote about was the fact that he would hang out in whorehouses and either get so drunk that he would pass out and have to be dragged back to wherever he was stationed, or after having sex with the prostitute, instead of giving her money, he would just beat them up. And this was the guy who was handpicked by Mary Lincoln to guard her husband. Keep in mind, not only was John Parker never disciplined for leaving the door unguarded to go and get drunk, he was never even questioned as a possible conspirator. Over 2,000 people were arrested as possible conspirators, but Parker was not one of them. There is no record that he was even questioned as a part of the investigation. Also keep in mind that Mary Todd Lincoln's mother's family name was Parker, so there could have been some family relation there. But even with that, she would have had to have known that he would be unreliable. So again, extremely suspect. And finally, did you know that the man who supposedly shot the man who everyone believed to be Booth at Garrett's barn was not Boston Corbett as stated in the official story? It was a man named Everton Conger. And there is strong evidence that suggests that Everton Conger had shoot-to-kill orders for Booth. In other words, there was no way that Booth was going to be brought back to D.C. alive. More than likely because he was going to start naming names. And if the man who was killed was actually not Booth, as it now seems was the case, then that is the irony of all ironies. Because that means that Booth had apparently outsmarted these guys. So, we're going to take a look at a lot of these things a bit closer. There will definitely be more Did You Know segments on the upcoming episodes of the Lincoln assassination. Now, to be fair to a lot of people who believe that Booth was in fact shot and killed at Garrett's barn, the enlisted man, I believe, who was a private, who originally refused to identify Booth's body, actually recanted later on, but that was because he found out that he wasn't going to get paid otherwise. So they had to sign something called a quitclaim. At that time, it was known as a quitclaim. I think today a quitclaim is actually related to real estate. But at that time, it was something that you signed that was similar to, I guess, what we would consider today to be a non-disclosure agreement. And both he and the company doctor were the ones who would recognize Booth because they were very familiar with him. The doctor even said, my wife drags me to the theater all the time. I know what Booth looks like. This guy is tall and has red hair and freckles, and this isn't Booth. And the enlisted man, the private, I'm not sure how he was personally familiar with Booth. I think at some point he was involved in some type of assignment that Booth was involved in and around D.C., but he was like, yeah, no, this isn't Booth. And then they were like, well, you're not going to get paid. And he was like, oh, did I say that this wasn't Booth? I meant to say that, yes, this is Booth. So he just signed the paper and you know, got his money, and that was that. So there is some conjecture involved and other things of that nature. So now let's hear from author and historian Don Thomas talking about his book entitled The Reason Booth Had to Die, which is centered around Booth's diary as well as the complete lack of motive for all of the low-level conspirators.
The early morning of April the 14th, 1865, when Lincoln was shot, Booth met with James Donaldson, then writes a confession article to the Washington newspaper. The article was destroyed, so he wrote the confession in his diary, and the diary pages were destroyed. So here it is on the 14th. Booth writes an article for the paper that's going to clear his name, shoots the president, runs down here to South Maryland, and sits for 8 days. Doesn't run, doesn't have an escape plan. He just sits there, and he's reading the paper, looking for his article, and he can't find it. It doesn't come out, and he thinks the government is withholding it. It's a little he left behind to clear his name, and so then he gets run out of Dense Meadow, and instead of getting in the boat and going downriver to Virginia, he goes upriver, west to a new hiding place. This is a friend of David Hurl's. They bird hunted together, and so he's still waiting. He's still holding out hope that these guys will come forward. That's what the letter was for, is his guarantee so they wouldn't double-cross him. He didn't realize that one of the guys he gave the letter to was one of the double-crossers. So he's standing here 8 days after shooting Lincoln on the north bank of the Potomac River looking south, and he writes in his diary that he has a greater mind to return to Washington and clear his name, which he feels he can do. How clear himself? By disclosing his accomplices? Yes, that's exactly what he was talking about. But then he says all is lost. He realizes they're not coming forward. So then that's when he gets in a boat. He goes downriver, goes to Virginia, and the whole time Baker and Stanton and all the spies, they have complete control over all the information coming in. Baker, he sends his 26 soldiers down there because he's after the reward money. And they surround the barn, and Everton Conger shoots Booth. It wasn't Boston Corbett, and that's proven. They still stick to that. But Everton Conger was told, do not bring Booth back to Washington alive, because if they did and he went on trial, all this would have come out. So they had to kill him. And so Conger takes Booth's diary, and he catches a boat here at Bell's Plain, a steamboat, and he takes an 8-hour boat ride back up to Washington. And during that trip, he copies the diary, and several people read it. And Stanton finds out about it, and he confiscates the diary from him, and he destroys the copy. The FBI report states that the diary pages were in fact unbound after Booth was dead and rebound before Congress was allowed to review the book's now altered pages. It can now be proven that the Judge Advocate General for the conspiracy trial, Joseph Holt, lied to Congress when he testified that Booth's diary was not spoliated. The entire mainstream history about Lincoln's assassination is a fabricated story handed down by Edwin Stanton and his War Department conspirators. It was a diabolical plot by a lot of powerful people, a lot of people that knew this story, or nobody knew the whole story, but they knew little parts of it. And who do you tell? I mean, what difference does it make? And then it all just fades away.
That was author and historian Don Thomas, and his book is called The Reason Booth Had to Die. And he makes some good points. I think he is of the mind that Booth was actually shot and killed at Garrett's barn. And in my opinion, I think that Booth knew that he was a patsy the same way that, a century later, Lee Harvey Oswald knew that he was a patsy. And just as in Dallas, Texas, the Texas Theater was the prearranged meeting place, I think that Garrett's farm was the prearranged meeting place. It was pre-designated, and Booth was supposed to go there. We know this because, again, Booth wasted a lot of time. He and supposedly David Harold, who were on the run from Union troops. They really took their time and fooled around, yet the posse, or the however you want to call it, the pursuing Union troops, they basically made a beeline directly for Garrett's farm. I mean, they didn't go any, alternate route through, the countryside of Maryland or Virginia. They literally set out directly for Garrett's barn. So someone knew that Booth was supposed to be there, or that he was there. And this posse was assembled by Lafayette Baker, who was Lincoln's supposed head of security. He was head of what we would consider today to be the Secret Service. And that whole company, or the posse of men, was led by his cousin, Lieutenant Luther Baker, and Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger, who served as an aide to Lafayette Baker. Both had returned to civilian life and were recruited specifically to lead this mission. So that's extremely suspect. They were joined by Lieutenant Edward Doherty and a detachment of 25 soldiers. After completing the mission, all involved signed quitclaims and collected a substantial amount of reward money. One of the troopers, as fate would have it, had met Booth previously. Also keep in mind that the same doctor who refused to positively ID Booth at Garrett's barn also refused to positively ID the body at the coroner's inquest. Dr. John Frederick May, who had previously seen Booth as a patient, noted that there is no resemblance in that corpse to Booth, nor can I believe it to be him. May added that the corpse, quote, looks to me much older and in appearance much more freckled than he was. I do not recollect that he was at all freckled, unquote. Dr. May would later write that the corpse's right limb was greatly contused and perfectly black from a fracture of one of the long bones. Surgeon General Barnes' report to Stanton, however, held that it was the left leg and foot that were injured and, quote, encased in an appliance of splints and bandages, thus clouding the waters even on such straightforward issues as which of the corpse's legs were injured. Now, there is some controversy on which leg Booth actually injured, if he did at all. You also have to understand that Dr. Mudd, who was one of the co-conspirators who would eventually be captured and tried and convicted and sentenced to prison, he actually stated on the record twice. He actually went on record and said that his leg was not broken, that he just had a sprained ankle, and that he said, quote, I doubt that it's that painful and the injury is not that severe. Now, it's difficult to understand which leg he was referring to because he didn't state that, but that is a really interesting contradiction if in fact it is true. There is definitely a lot of controversy in this case, and I think there is overwhelming evidence that there was a massive and far-reaching conspiracy that involved some very powerful people who did not want Lincoln to have a second term. So before we close out part 1 of the Abraham Lincoln assassination episode, let's hear an email question from a subscriber.
A subscriber email about John Wilkes Booth. Do you think Booth, and possibly others on his level, was set up by the highest level conspirators who were also Lincoln's political enemies? What is your opinion of Booth's diary, and do you think Booth escaped capture?
That's a great question. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Just to take the last part first, yes, I do think that he escaped capture. I do not believe that he was the man who was shot and killed in a barn at the Garrett farm. I think that he somehow understood along the way, possibly on the run, supposedly on the run, even though no one was even chasing them at first. Somehow it occurred to him at some point that he was probably a patsy in all this, and I think he simply decided to make other plans and did not go to the prearranged meeting place. In regard to his diary, in some ways I think the diary is a red herring. I think that yes, it could be a key to understanding some of the mystery surrounding this case, but it also could be completely contrived. And there's also some controversy about where the diary was found. Some people say that the diary was on the person of the man who was shot and killed. Other people say that the diary was found in a carriage that Booth had been riding in, supposedly because his leg was injured. So, I'm not sure. It is definitely entertaining to investigate the possibilities of what the diary might be. I think it is very interesting that elements of the government were trying to suppress the diary as late as the 1970s. So, whatever it was, someone went through a lot of trouble to cover up the diary's contents. Now, that could be all part of the ruse or the misdirection. That's still not to say that the diary is, genuine. It may be a plant and it may be a red herring, and the fact that they're covering it up may make it seem as if it has important information in it. I'm not sure. It could be the real deal, but who knows? And yes, I definitely think that Booth was set up by the highest level conspirators, along with all the other co-conspirators who were captured and tried, and definitely the ones who were hanged without any due process. Whatever they were railroaded. And it's important to note that almost none of them were actual quote-unquote Southerners. Most of them were from Maryland and Pennsylvania. If I'm not mistaken, the only co-conspirator who actually served in the Confederate Army was John Surratt, who basically globetrotted. This guy traveled halfway around the world and met with a lot of high-ranking foreign officials, and a lot of people assumed that he was some type of intelligence agent. In fact, when he was in Naples, Italy, he was sheltered by the local police and allowed to sleep at the station as a non-paying guest for 3 nights. He eventually booked passage to Malta and then to Alexandria, Egypt. And on November 27, 1866, he was finally arrested by U.S. authorities. Now, he went to trial in 1867 and was acquitted. So there is a lot of mystery surrounding that, as well as John Wilkes Booth and the other co-conspirators. We've come to the end of part 1 of the Abe Lincoln assassination episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Open Homicide podcast channel. And be sure to stay tuned for part 2. I'm Skip Pulley. Thank you again for listening. Y'all be safe and one love.